Atheist Alliance International podcast.
I don't make this stuff up.
You know, if you put Jesus Christ first, that he'll look after all your bills.
It's not fake, it's faith.
And welcome to the latest episode of the Atheist Alliance International podcast. I'm your host, Jason Sylvester. Today I'm joined by author Paul Clark, who's written a book called The Omega Course. So we're going to dive into what that refers to and the textual deconstructions that he provides in his book. So Paul, thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so maybe just for our viewers, maybe just give the background for them on what the Omega Course is referring to.
Okay, it's a riff on the Alpha Course. The Alpha Course is a fairly conservative Christian course, which is a kind of ABC of Christianity for people who want to become Christians. And my book is the Omega Course, which is kind of giving the opposite point of view. It's a novel, but it's a novel written in the style of books like Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance or Sophie's World, which melds fiction and non-fiction. And in my novel, one character joins the Alpha Course because of a crisis in his life, seeking redemption in Christianity. And there he meets a theology student whose nickname is Omega B. And she gives him an Omega course, which kind of gives the opposite point of view and goes into the history of Christianity and the history of the Bible and where they come from. And so my central character is torn between Alpha and Omega as the novel progresses.
And so the antagonist, I guess, would be the girl who's providing the information. So you're saying she's a theologian, but she's a
theology student, but her faith is crumbling. And this is actually quite a common thing. I spoke with a guy called Robert Shaw, who has his own podcast, the Unsure Podcast. And he said he's interviewed a lot of people who went to university as very strong, quite conservative Christians to study theology. And then as they studied theology, it really challenged their faith. And it's not uncommon for theology students to lose their faith. And my character B is like that. She's losing her faith. In fact, her faith is crumbling all around her. And the Omega course she's giving is very much a secular argument. It's saying what secular scholars can say about the history of Christianity and the history of the Bible.
That point you mentioned that in the Shaw podcast. So that point has been made repeatedly. Bart Ehrman makes it. Daniel Dennett, the late Daniel Dennett, has made it in one of his articles. I'll post the links for people to find. I interviewed on this podcast. Interviewed Greg Dawes, who's a former Catholic priest, and he made the exact same comment that what you learn in seminary versus what you get up in the pulpit and preach is in many cases often very, very different. So that's you're correct. That's not an uncommon thing to have. So and we chatted just before the podcast. My own book, shameless plug here, my own book, Manifest Insanity, discusses the same sort of thing that your book does. It presents historical arguments for why the Bible cannot be to deconstruct the evangelical arguments, why the Bible cannot be literally true and without error. Okay, so let's dive into the book then. We mentioned that, we discussed before the podcast that it's based on the documentary hypothesis. So let's explain to people what that is. So we could both do it, but you're the guest, so I'll turn it over to you to explain what that is.
It was noticed back in the Middle Ages. Scholars noticed that the Bible very frequently, in the early books of the Bible, it tells the same story twice. Or there's two slightly different versions of the same story that are often mixed together. And this has been known for a long time by biblical scholars. And then in the 18th century, somebody twigged that the Bible uses different words for God. In English translation, it uses God, and it uses the Lord God, with Lord written in capital letters. And these are Elohim and Yahweh. And somebody twigged in the 18th century that if you separate the strands that use the word Yahweh from the strands that use the word God, They both make sense on their own. And from that, people worked out that there were a number of books that had been woven together to make the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And the documentary hypothesis was formulated in the 19th century, which kind of was trying to synthesize these ideas. And the person who synthesized them, Jacob Wellhausen, he said there are 4 documents which are woven together. He called them J, E, P, and D. J refers to God as Yahweh, right from the beginning. Yahweh begins with a J in German. E refers to God as Elohim. P is written by someone who's very concerned with priestly matters and the duties and the rights of priests and the importance of priests. So he's called the priestly writer. And then D is the Deuteronomist. And these have been woven together. And the documentary hypothesis in scholarship dominated biblical scholarship throughout the 20th century, especially in the second half of the 20th century. It's kind of come under attack a bit in the 21st century. And some people are saying J is not a single document. J is a collection of fragments of different documents, and E is not a single document. It's a collection of fragments of different documents. My character B says at one stage, I've got one lecturer at university who tells me the documentary hypothesis is a bit dated and I should speak about P, D, and not P. And I've got another lecturer at university who says, no, the documentary hypothesis is the only game in town. So it's a matter of controversy in modern scholarship, just how true Wellhausen's theory was. But people believe on the whole, in scholarship, there's no disagreement that the book of Genesis, for example, is 2 or 3 documents which have been woven together. And you can see, for example, 2 accounts of creation. Genesis 1 has one account of creation. Genesis 2 is a separate account of creation. And they have the order of creation. It's quite different in the 2 of them. There are 2 versions of Noah's Ark. And in an appendix at the end of my book, I present the 2 versions of Noah's Ark independently, and then the way that they've been woven together in the Bible. And this is not controversial among Bible scholars. It's pretty much, apart from your fundamentalists or your very evangelical conservatives, it's universally accepted that this is the case. And as I was saying to you before we started the recording, when I first came across this, my attitude was, why doesn't everybody know this? If everybody knew this, there wouldn't be any fundamentalists, because you cannot take the Bible literally when you see that there are 2 different versions of the key stories within the Bible. They can't both be true. It doesn't mean you have to be an atheist. I mean, a lot of this work was done by Christian scholars, but you cannot be a fundamentalist. And my book, I see it as very much, it's an attack on fundamentalism. It's saying this is how the Bible came to be written, and therefore fundamentalism has to be wrong. It can't be correct.
Yeah, it sounds like your book and my book very much similar, both attacking that literalist mindset to provide the historical context and how the Bible came about. So yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of symmetries between our thinking there. One of the points I made in my book is, and it ties together. I don't know if you or if our viewers have read the book, The Bible Unearthed by Israel Finkelstein, sort of tying the documentary hypothesis into the Bible Unearthed, and the points they make is that during the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom of Israel, you got, aside from those who were deported by the Assyrians, the remainder of the population, the refugees essentially, are coming down into the kingdom of southern Judah, who is compiling and writing the Bible. And I believe it was in Finkelstein's book. It's been well over 10 years since I read it, but I'm pretty sure it was in Finkelstein's book that he made the claim that the incorporation of these northern ideas, that the northern god of El, etc., gets then accommodated into these southern writings, where you have Yahweh in the south and Elohim or El in the north, additionally, you have references in the Bible to a northern altar at Bethel, as well as the sanctuary in Jerusalem. You've got an Aaronid and a Levite priesthood, and so that is then what is trying to accommodate and incorporate these northern entities and existing religious traditions into the southern ones, and kind of creating this mishmash, this, as the documentary hypothesis puts forward. So it's interesting from the perspective of, anthropologically, that they're trying to assimilate northern elements into southern religious traditions, and that's where you get this view of the documentary hypothesis. Another book on it you may have read, other people may not have read, The Battle for God by Karen Armstrong, about fundamentalism in all three religions. And she talks about how the birth of this literal evangelical fundamentalism comes about in response to the uncertainty of the Industrial Revolution, where society is changing so rapidly that the Princeton Theological Seminary comes up with systematic theology, or a systematic application such to scientifically prove the Bible, which obviously is ludicrous. But that this fundamental literal reading of the Bible emerges in response to the Industrial Revolution, and that's where people like you and I came along and fight back against this perspective that the Bible, cannot be literally true and without error, because obviously it's been compiled. There are contradictions. There are outright mistakes. As you said, like there's different stories, like the what's the story? The story of the tablets, right? There's, I believe, 3 different stories of Moses receiving the tablets and the 10 Commandments.
Yeah, it's very interesting that the idea that the Bible should be taken literally is a fairly modern idea. If you go back to the early church, you've got people like Origen, who was in the 3rd, the 4th century, and he said, "Who would be so childish as to believe that God made the world in 7 days? And who is so foolish as to believe that God planted a garden in Eden?" And this is one of the fathers of the church, one of the most important people in the early church. And he read the story of the Garden of Eden and the story of the creation as analogies. And there was a very strong tradition, which was in Judaism and which was in ancient Greek society, that you don't take your holy text literally. And I think Origen even said the mistakes and the contradictions put in the Bible are put there deliberately by God to remind us not to take it literally, and to remind us to look for the deeper meaning inside the text. And the Roman Catholic Church was pretty careful about keeping a monopoly of how you interpret the text, and having the debate stay within certain boundaries. But it wasn't really until the printing press and the translation of the Bible and the Protestant Revolution that the Bible was taken so literally. And as you say, fundamentalism is a reaction to the modern world, and it is a modern phenomenon. It's not a traditional phenomenon. And I think this is something fundamentalists themselves don't know and don't understand, and I think they should. Another thing I would say about ancient Israel is, one interesting thing I read was archaeologists studying pre-literate societies can guess which gods that society worshipped by the names they gave to places and the names they gave themselves. And with Israel, the clue is in the name, Israel. That originally the ancient Israelites, their chief god was not Yahweh, their chief god was El, who was the chief god of the Canaanite pantheon. And Yahweh came much later. Latest research says he probably came from a tribe that migrated north round about 1000 BCE. He was associated with the Exodus from Egypt, so this could be a tribe that had had some kind of connection with the Egyptians, migrated north, mostly into the northern kingdom, but into the southern kingdom as well. And there's a passage which I always try and remember the reference, but I always forget it. It's part of the Song of Moses, which is in Deuteronomy, where it says, the Lord, the Most High, distributed the nations and Jacob became God's inheritance. But if you looked at the Septuagint, the translation should really read, when El distributed the nations among the gods, he gave Israel to Jacob. He gave Jacob to Yahweh. So it's not that Yahweh chose the Israelites as his chosen people. It's that El, the king of the gods, gave Israel to Yahweh, said, that's your nation. And at some stage, Yahweh became the royal God, the national God, probably of Israel and of Judah. And as happened in a lot of countries, because he was the national God, he began to take over the powers of other gods. One of the things Yahweh acquired was El's wife, Asherah, as his wife. And he became more and more important. He began to take over some of the powers of the sun god and things like that. And within Israel, there came a new idea, henotheism, which is there are many gods, but we should only worship one of them. And that God is Yahweh. And this was the idea that the refugees brought from Israel down to Jerusalem. The idea that we have a special bond, a covenant with Yahweh, and we should only worship him. And there's recent scholarship which is suggesting that the move from henotheism to monotheism, from the idea we only worship one God, but there are many, to monotheism, the idea there's only one God, that this is actually very late. If you read a book, The Invention of God by Thomas Romer, he suggests that this happened after the Babylonian exile. So this is in the 6th century BCE, and it could even be later than that. And most of the texts of the Torah, the Pentateuch, the early part of the Bible, they were written in the 7th and the 8th centuries BC. So they were written by polytheists who were promoting a henotheist program that we only worship Yahweh. But they didn't believe that Yahweh was the only God. And this is why you see a lot of things. This is why Yahweh behaves like he does. Yahweh in the Torah is a monster. He's slaughtering people left, right, and center. Some people have said, you know, the villain in the Bible is not Satan. The villain in the Bible is God, because he kills far more people than Satan does in the Bible. This is why Yahweh behaves like he does in the Torah, because he's a pagan God. He's a polytheistic God. And the early Jews, when they became monotheistic, they were stuck with these polytheistic texts or henotheistic texts of the books of the Bible. And that's why they started to interpret them not literally, but allegorically, saying, you know, where it says God slaughtered the Canaanites, well, he didn't really. This is something, it's an allegory. We have to interpret this allegory and try and find the deeper meaning inside it. And it's this history of how the Bible came to be written, which has led to allegorical interpretations of the Bible. And then now you've got these fundamentalists who are interpreting it literally, and they're not understanding where the holy text came from or the history of the religion that they're promoting. And you know, this is something I feel people should know about this.
Yeah, I make that same point all the time, especially to evangelicals, that if your faith is so important to you, why are you completely ignorant of the history of your beliefs? And they don't want to know. You know, they just want to take everything at face value. They don't want to dig beneath the surface.
Yeah, that's it. And you know, there are liberal Christian scholars who are finding this stuff out. You know, a lot of this has been found out by Jewish scholars, but also Protestant scholars, Catholic scholars, and atheist scholars are finding this stuff out and publicizing it. And some of it, I do look at them and think, you know, how can you still be a Christian if that's what you think? But they are. Yeah. And, you know, we have to accept that people interpret things in different ways and have different ideas and so forth. But yeah, I do find it odd that some of them are still Christians. Even though
it's not even just some people. Like Bart Ehrman on his podcast recently was discussing his colleagues, like New Testament scholars who believe in Christianity, even though they know the history and they teach the history. And it's definitely a question that's boggled my mind in the past as well. Like, how can you be a New Testament scholar to know this history and still be a Christian? It just smacks of an intellectual dishonesty, to be perfectly frank, that they're just
Or
unwilling to let go.
it's kind of a blind spot, isn't it?
Yeah.
I sent my book to a friend who was a Christian before it was published, and he sent it to two Anglican priests, liberal Anglican priests. One of them, in the comments who wrote about it, you could see that he hated the Alpha Course, and he quite agreed with all the criticisms of the Alpha Course that are in the book. But he said where he disagreed with me was I couldn't see why we should keep the Bible, but he could see why we should keep the Bible. And I'm thinking, yeah, it's great literature. Some of it is great literature. And, a few books are wonderful books. I think Ecclesiastes is up there with the Greek philosophers. It's almost existentialist in its approach. But I think it's time we let the Bible go and put it with the Iliad and the Odyssey is great literature. But
don't say that to Jordan Peterson disagree with you strenuously that we're putting Western civilization at risk by abandoning the Judeo-Christian ethic as he goes on about ad nauseum. So, but I digress. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole.
Well, you were talking about this on your podcast recently with about what's the name of the lady who just converted to Christianity from atheism?
Ayaan Hirsi Ali.
That's it.
Yeah,
that's
her
it.
cultural Christianity.
It seems to me hers is an elitist position, which perhaps you see with some of these Bible scholars. It's okay for us to know that it's rubbish, but the hoi polloi, we need them to believe that it's all true.
And yet that attitude is not new. That shows up again and again and again. It shows up in the writings of Ibn Rushd, known as Averroes in the West, the Muslim scholar in the 1200s in Andalusian Spain. It shows up in Spinoza that religion is useful for the common people, but the philosophers obviously we can determine for ourselves. So that argument is millennial.
Even Voltaire was saying pretty much the same thing, wasn't he? It's all right to know these things, but we don't want everyone else to know it. And
it's like there's that.
I think everybody needs to know.
It's a mistaken attribution to Seneca that religion is useful for the rulers and whatever the quote is, but it's not actually Seneca. It comes from Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. So yeah, but how religion, it's a useful control mechanism. Isn't there a quote by Napoleon as well? Like religion is what keeps the poor people from murdering the rich. So
yeah. Which you see this as a kind of atheist meme, which I think some of our fellow atheists get wrong, that the religious leaders, there are charlatans among them, and a lot of them behave like charlatans, but I think they also genuinely believe it.
Oh yeah, for sure. But that doesn't make it any more true.
It's not a scam; it's a mistake.
Yeah, I've been saying for at least a decade, religion is always political. It's always about using politics to control the masses. So it's in my own personal podcast. My logo it's a stylized Venn diagram of social, political, and religious, and how it all comes together to make history. You reminded me of something there. It's gone again. Then it'll come back. History is it's overlooked by so many people that if as you said, if people just understood, we'd have probably far fewer problems in the world, or maybe that's just being overly optimistic. But I think if people actually took the time to read your book and to learn this kind of history, the believers would have a harder time. But again, Like to quote the TV show House, rational arguments don't work on religious people. Otherwise, we wouldn't have religious people. So
Yeah. There's other things that I look at in the book. I give quite a lot of prominence to the problem of evil. That Yuval Noah Harari, in his book *Sapiens*, he makes the point: we've got this thing in our heads of religious progress. First there was animism, and then there was polytheism, and then there was monotheism. And monotheism was progress against what polytheism stood for. And he says, no, monotheism is not intellectually coherent, but polytheism is. In polytheism, the gods aren't very nice. And so when something horrible happens, well, maybe the gods were having a bad day and they took it out on you. Or in Greek religion, maybe it wasn't even the gods because they're not all powerful. It was the fates that decided this horrible thing was going to happen to you. And the fates don't care. You can't blame them for what they did to you because they're completely indifferent. But monotheism proposes this all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-loving God. And you have a big problem if you've got an all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-loving God, and terrible things happen. Because the question arises, how can God allow these terrible things to happen? And what I kind of realized when I was writing is that the whole of Christianity is a response to this question. The first answer to how can God allow terrible things to happen if he loves us is, well, maybe he's punishing us. Yeah, maybe God is just. And whatever happens to us, we deserve it because we have sinned. And there are books in the Bible that specifically knock this idea. One of them is Ecclesiastes, which is saying, you know, I've seen it in my life. I've seen the good people suffering terribly and evil people living long in their wickedness. And you've got the book of Job, where Job is a perfect, good, just man who suffers terribly. And so if there's no justice on earth, then you get the idea, well, there's justice in the afterlife. That's how the afterlife developed. That's a way for God to dispense his justice, that, yeah, good people may suffer in the here and now on this earth, but they're going to go to heaven and everything's going to be all right. All the bad guys will either be annihilated or they'll go to hell. And that is, you know, that the problem of evil is where the idea of the afterlife really comes from. That's the only way that divine justice can really happen, because there's precious little sign of it happening here on earth. Then another idea is to give God an antagonist. So why do terrible things happen? Well, God's got this enemy, Satan. And Satan is a very minor figure in the earlier parts of the Old Testament. He's actually working for God. In the book of Job, Satan is an ally of God who does God's bidding and is a bit of a provocateur. The snake in the Garden of Eden has got nothing to do with Satan. That was later kind of projected onto the snake by Christian theologians. But Satan becomes, under monotheism, Satan becomes a very powerful figure who is God's antagonist and who is screwing everything up and making us all suffer. And if you've got the idea of this great antagonist of God, then the next thing that comes along is the idea of eschatology, that eventually there will be a titanic battle between good and evil, between God and Satan, which will end in God's victory. And from this, you get the idea of a Messiah who will lead the forces of God in this great battle against Satan. And that's where you get Christianity from. So in a sense, Christianity is a response to the problem of evil. And they still haven't answered it. You know, how can so many terrible things happen to so many innocent people if you've got an all-knowing, all-loving, all-powerful God? It doesn't work.
Yeah, I would recommend to our viewers who might wish to learn more about this, there's a great book called The Birth of Satan by two Catholic professors, T.J. Ray, and apologies, I forget the second author's name, where they discuss how Satan emerges in the literature like you said, in the book of Job, he's, Hasatan, the original with the article has means the advocate or the obstacle. He's working on God's behalf. He has to basically be unleashed in Job, and how Satan then evolves in literature of the intertestamental period, which is the period following the last book of Daniel and the first letters of Paul. In this apocalyptic writing, Satan is evolving and gets absorbed into Christianity. So the birth of Satan is a good book to look into that history. Just quickly, just back up for a second. But the other point I was forgetting about, like, on the politics and religion, in the documentary "The Bible on Earth," Professor Baruch Halpern makes a brilliant point that the temple in Jerusalem just happened to sit in the backyard of the Davidic royal palace. So, there's that intricate link between religion and politics and social control. So back to the Satan evolving. So yeah, that's that. You also mentioned the afterlife. That again also comes out of Daniel. It's during the Maccabean revolt when Judaism sees that it's potentially about to be annihilated by the sort of what's the Hellenistic Jews, who are looking more towards Athens than Jerusalem, and they fight this battle for the soul of the nation, because the Maccabees are zealots who want to hang on to their identity and not be assimilated by Greek culture. And during this battle is when you see, so the book of Daniel is written during this time. This is like sort of the first explicit reference to an afterlife and to a resurrection. Daniel chapter 12, I believe it's verse 2, is the resurrection. And a Yale professor, John J. Collins, his professor of Old Testament criticism, in his book, The Short Introduction to God, I think it's that book. I'll put up a link to it. Discusses how the fact that these are radically new ideas in Judaism, this concept that the messianic kingdom comes about in the afterlife, it won't occur here. So it's interesting how things have shifted around a little bit.
Yeah. And another thing I look at, I don't know if you do in your book, I look at the historical Jesus, and the quest for the historical Jesus, and the gradual discovery by Bible scholars of who Jesus was. I think they still don't agree exactly who he was, and to a certain extent there's a limited number of facts that we know about him. He was almost certainly born in Nazareth, we know that. He was baptized by John the Baptist, we know that. And he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, we know that. And we don't know much else, actually. The rest of what we think we know about him is best guess, conjecture, probably, maybe. But the picture that has emerged of Jesus, that I think most scholars would accept, is that he was an eschatological preacher who was preaching the end of the world. He was preaching it to Jews. He wasn't very interested in Gentiles at all. And he preached that it was about to happen. And then he got crucified for his pains, and that was the end of that. And it's something that's a bit embarrassing for Christians that it hasn't happened yet. I think it was supposed to happen about 3 weeks ago, wasn't it? There was another end of the world about to happen, and it's been about to happen for the last 2,000 years. There have been dozens and dozens and dozens of prophecies that the end of the world is about to happen. But that's what Jesus was preaching. The world as we know it is about to come to an end. So in the book, I go through how scholars unearth the historical Jesus and the techniques that they've used to analyze the Gospels and try and pick out the little granules, the little nuggets of truth amid all the myth about Jesus. And I spend quite a lot of time looking at the resurrection, because the resurrection is key. I can remember one book, I think it was Hans Kung's book on being a Christian. He talked about, when I have doubts, my mind goes back to that empty tomb. And it's the empty tomb of Jesus, which is the key thing that makes me think, yes, Jesus was the Son of God, etc., etc. So I spend quite a lot of time analyzing the empty tomb and how do we explain the empty tomb? And essentially, I think I give 15 possible explanations in the book. And I invite the reader to divide them into 3 categories. Possible but not very likely, and yeah, right, pull the other one. Possible explanation, number 1, there never was an empty tomb. Somebody made it up. And they made it up because crucifixion was a very shameful punishment. It was not just a horrible way to die, it was a shameful way to die. It was something reserved for the dregs of society, for slaves, for pirates, for people like that. Nobody upper class, no Roman citizen ever got crucified. It could only be done to the lower orders of society. Jesus would have been crucified naked, and almost certainly his body would have been left on the cross to rot and to be picked at by crows. And this was a deterrent. It was there to remind people just how big and how bad the Romans could be. And for a Jew, this is absolutely appalling, because in Deuteronomy, it says if you are left to hang on a tree overnight after you die, you will be cursed by God. So this was an appalling end to Jesus's life. And as far as we know, standard practice was, once the body was eventually taken down, quite a long time after death, it would be thrown in a common grave. And that would be standard practice. There's been a lot of debate about this by scholars, but I think the majority would say, yes, that's standard practice. The only thing I think that could have got him buried in a tomb would be a bribe. And I think scholars sometimes forget that in Roman society, a large enough bribe given to the right person could probably get quite a lot of things done. So it is possible that somebody paid a large bribe to the right person and got the body off the Romans and put it in a tomb. So maybe the tomb is an invention. There was never a tomb at all, and the story of the empty tomb was invented to cover up this fact. Or maybe someone did pay a bribe and put him in a tomb. Another explanation, which I came across quite recently, is that the empty tomb is a trope, that it's something that appears all over the place in Jewish and Greek mythology, that the tomb of the prophet, the tomb of the hero is empty, and people understand this as a symbolic way of saying, this person is now with the gods, or this person is now seated at the right hand of God. And it was never meant to be taken literally. It's just a trope. And this trope kind of was taken literally and appeared in the Bible. The other explanations I give that fall into the possible category is, yes, somebody paid a bribe, got him buried in a tomb, and then someone nicked the body. And it could be the Roman authorities nicked the body because they didn't want it. The Jewish authorities nicked the body, or it could be relatives of the people who owned the tomb nicked the body because they thought a crucified criminal polluted the tomb, or the owners of nearby tombs nicked the body. Any of these are possible explanations of the empty tomb. And then you get the, yeah, right, pull the other one, which would be something like aliens nicked the body, or it was spontaneous combustion, or he came back to life and walked out. And I say that explanation belongs in the, yeah, right, pull the other one category. So the idea of Jesus getting up and walking out of the tomb, that's kind of the bottom of my list of explanations, and it's the least possible explanation for the empty tomb. There are much better explanations, and if you apply Occam's razor and you go for the simplest explanation, it's either there never was an empty tomb or somebody nicked the body.
Do you go into the then gospel accounts of the empty tomb? So I pulled up here. So Mark 16 originally ends at verse 8. The later verses were added later. So reading Mark 16 verse 8 says, trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. So that was the original.
Bit of a question there. If they said nothing to anyone, well, how do we know?
Yeah. So do you dive into that in your book as well?
I dive into Mark, but I don't go into the others.
Okay.
Yeah, because the others are all slightly different, aren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah. I go on from there to talk about the Jesus's appearances, and to talk about hallucinations and bereavement hallucinations, which are very common. Bart Ehrman suggests that three people had a religious experience. I think he suggests Peter, Mary Magdalene, and Paul, much later, had religious experiences. We don't actually have an eyewitness account. This is something Christian apologists get wrong. They say, there were 500 eyewitnesses. We have eyewitnesses accounts. No, we don't. We have accounts in Acts of the Apostles and accounts in some of the Gospels, written decades later by people who didn't witness the events in question. The nearest thing we've got is Paul, who doesn't actually say very much about how Jesus appeared to him. He just says, I've had an encounter with Jesus, and Jesus appeared to me. I think that's pretty much all that Paul says. In Acts of the Apostles, it gives details of this, but we don't know that the author of Acts ever actually met Paul. So there are no eyewitness accounts to the resurrection. So when Christian apologists come and say, we've got eyewitness accounts, it definitely happened. No, there's no evidence. There's just hearsay evidence.
Yeah. Can I give my speculation?
Yeah.
So building on your point of Occam's razor, Bart Ehrman again he's suggested one or multiple of his books that the name in Aramaic, the name Thomas means twin. So you have Judas Thomas, and in Mark, I think Mark chapter 3 or chapter 6, it lists the brothers of Jesus. Jude or Judas is one of them. So my speculation, my Occam's razor is, was there a post sighting of Jesus? No. His twin brother? Yes. Is that enough to have sparked the visions, of a resurrection, given his message? Like Ehrman talks about how Paul is a believer in the end times as well. This is very common in first century Judaism, expecting the end times, this apocalypticism. And so that when Paul sees Jesus or a vision, or maybe he sees Jesus's twin brother, he's then, what would he conclude? That the end times have begun. If I'm seeing a resurrected end times preacher, then the end times must surely have begun. So that's my thinking. It's the twin brother Thomas that people saw.
There's all kinds of things. Another thing that Christians often give, or apologists often give, as evidence to the resurrection is how the disciples behaved afterwards. And they say,
in which gospel? Because they're all different.
Yeah. When the crucifixion happened, all the disciples panicked and ran away and denounced Jesus and so forth, or renounced Jesus and so forth. And then they suffered terrible persecution, etc., etc. And there's a lot, we can see it in our own time. When people make prophecies about the end times and the end times don't happen, what happens to the followers? Do they give up? No, they don't. They carry on. I watched a documentary not long ago about Waco, the siege in Waco, which ended with this terrible massacre of so many people who were followers of David Koresh, who was a lunatic, who was a sexual abuser, who led these people to disaster. And do they denounce him? Do they renounce him? No, they don't. The survivors say he was great. He was wonderful. He was our Messiah. We still believe in him. And
yet he also predicted that the world was going to come to an end by like 1995, like sometime in 95. And yet here we are 30 years later. Still hasn't happened.
We're still waiting. And there's nothing unusual in the way the disciples behaved after Jesus was crucified. It happens again and again and again that people expect the world to end. Everything goes wrong. The Messiah betrays them. The Messiah dies. I mean, there's even the case of Shabbatai Javi, who was a Jewish Messiah in 1660s, who converted to Islam. And did his followers abandon him? No, they didn't. They converted to Islam too. And there are still 100,000 of them left in Turkey who are secretly Jewish, but publicly Islamic. And there's nothing unusual about the way the disciples behaved after Jesus died. That's what's happened. That's what people do. They double down and they keep believing. So, the evidence that is given for the resurrection, it's just not there. There's no evidence whatsoever.
You mentioned Nazareth earlier, so on the previous podcast, I can't remember if it was the immediately last one, but we'll post the link here. The guys are doing some scientific analysis on the texts of the Bible, and they made a point: Nazareth does not exist in first century Judaism. It doesn't show up on any maps until like the second century CE. So even Nazareth was a late sort of attribution of where Jesus came from. That shows up sometime in the second century, because there's nothing on him. That was the first time I'd actually heard that. I had never heard before that Nazareth does not exist in the first century.
I read an article quite recently which was about Nazareth, and they were saying actually it wasn't the tiny village that we thought it was. It actually had a Greek part and a Jewish part, and was a little bit bigger, and it was on a trade route. Do you follow Tim O'Neill's blog, History for Atheists?
No.
Oh, you should try it.
Never heard of him before.
It's a great blog. It's a very angry blog because he gets very angry with atheists spouting nonsense, basically. And he's a historian, and he says, read the history, learn the history, and don't spout nonsense. One of the things he says, Nazareth is very important because it's the criterion of embarrassment. How do we know Jesus actually existed? How do we know that the Gospels are not pure myth? And he says the criterion of embarrassment is one of the most important things that teaches us this. The criterion of embarrassment is if there's something in the Gospel that kind of undermines the Christian message, it's likely to be authentic. And he cites three things in particular which are in the Gospels which undermine the Christian message. And number one, he says, is Jesus came from Nazareth. And he says, why on earth would they invent Nazareth? Because the Messiah was supposed to come from Bethlehem. So why invent this tiny little place in the back end of beyond and say Jesus came from there? And he says the only reason that Nazareth could be in the Gospels is because it's true. And they couldn't leave it out because people knew that Jesus did come from Nazareth. And so they invented all these birth narratives that have him somehow being born in Bethlehem, two completely different birth narratives in Matthew and Luke that place the birth in Bethlehem. But in fact, he was from Nazareth. The second one that Tim O'Neill stresses is Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist. He said that is very, very problematic for the early church because it's inherent in the ceremony of baptism that the baptizer is superior to the person being baptized. So the incident where John baptizes Jesus, John is superior to Jesus at that point. And you have to remember that at that time, John's followers were still around as a rival sect to the Jesus sect. So why on earth would Christians invent that story if it wasn't true? The only reason that story is there is because it's true and they couldn't leave it out because everybody knew it happened. And then for Tim O'Neill, the third thing that is proof of Jesus' existence is the crucifixion, that this was such a shameful punishment for anyone to suffer. There's no way Christians would invent a death like that for their Messiah. It's just too shameful. And so that, again, is evidence that Jesus did exist.
Yeah, that the birth narrative of putting it in Bethlehem. So that comes from Micah, I believe, chapter 5. Don't quote me on that, which is post-exilic from the Babylonian Empire. It's part of the documentary hypothesis. It's from the priestly source. This is a late addition to the book of Micah, which is a pre-exilic book. I mean, I believe Micah is one of the early prophets, like Isaiah, and Isaiah itself is three separate books. First Isaiah is like 800s, and then you've got a section in the middle, and then you have a post-exilic priestly source to Isaiah. This idea that, and again, this kind of comes back to this literal interpretation, that how can you have this post-exilic reference to the Messiah in a book that predates the loss of the Davidic dynasty to the Babylonian exile? So you've got these two inconsistent things. You've got a pre-exilic book and a post-exilic reference to the Messiah will come from Bethlehem, and they just don't mesh. So.
Yeah. And there's the other funny thing in the birth narratives is both Matthew and Luke have a genealogy of Joseph, Jesus' stepfather, proving that Joseph was descended from David. And I did the work, I did the homework, I did my own research, as they like to say.
Me too.
I
created a little meme. Me too.
Yeah, on a piece of paper and put them next to each other. And basically, they don't mesh at all. I don't
At
think
all.
in the last part, they don't have anything in common at all.
No, not at all. They descend. Right from the beginning, they descend from two different sons of David.
Yeah, that's it.
Like in Matthew, it follows Solomon, and in Luke, I can't remember. In my genealogy, so I'll actually flash it up on screen. Matthew follows Chronicles. I want to say Chronicles. There's a genealogy in Chronicles that Matthew is loosely following the genealogy in Chronicles, and Luke has essentially just made everything up. And there's one sort of overlap in between. They both come down, and they both meet around Zerubbabel, who was the exilarch. So let me explain that term. The exilarch was essentially the king in exile. It's a little bit confusing because in the book of Jeremiah, and maybe one other book, I can't remember, it mentions that the Babylonians essentially kill the last king of Judah, which then why the messianic restoration would necessarily involve divine intervention, that God's going to have to reconstitute the Davidic line because it's been extinct. So Zerubbabel theoretically is the king in exile in Babylon, and he comes back to Jerusalem when Cyrus the Great frees people. And these are the only sort of messianic expectations, and you see it in, like, I think Zechariah and Haggai, the books of the Bible, I believe, are the only ones. If you look about a year ago, I'll put the link in the description. There was a podcast with John Collins, again from Yale. We discussed this. And Zerubbabel is essentially like where the two genealogies kind of converge and then diverge again. So just some context there.
But this is, again, fundamentalists. They must know this. All these fundamentalist preachers, they must know this. They've got their Bibles. They know their Bibles off by heart. How can they not see that these two genealogies don't mesh?
There's no error.
And then how can you take the Bible literally? If they must have this blind spot.
It's mental gymnastics.
It is.
The useless hoops they force themselves to jump through.
It is. Yeah. Amazing. So, my book is not against Christianity. I'm not a Christian. I'm an atheist. But my book is not against Christianity per se. It's against literalist interpretations of the Bible, or fundamentalist interpretations of the Bible, because those are the kind of interpretations that lead to intolerance. And that in the United States right now, I think it's quite scary what's happening. There's this Christian nationalist undercurrent that's united with probably the first atheist president the USA ever had, Donald Trump, and is producing something pretty frightening, and which they're trying to export. I mean, you live in Bangkok. I used to live in Bangkok. I encountered Christian missionaries in Bangkok. I spent a month studying Thai at a school on Surawang Road. And I encountered these missionaries. Most of the students at the language school were missionaries who were being paid to study Thai for 9 months. A lot of people were putting a lot of money into evangelizing to the Thais. And at first I thought they were quite nice people and, they're being idealistic. Okay, I don't agree with them, but fair enough. They're doing what they think is right. And then in one of my lessons, the word sin came up. And I didn't understand the Thai word for sin. So I said, what's that? So the teacher got another student to explain it to me. And she explained it in Thai. And she said, a sin is when you tell a lie or you steal something or you're mean to someone. But sin is where you do not have Jesus Christ in your heart. And I sat there completely gobsmacked. This is what these people believe. Oh my God. And there's so much time and effort being put into evangelizing in places like Thailand, in Central America, and in South America. And the results of this, I think, are horrendous. Bolsonaro in Brazil, a lot of his base was evangelical. And you had the murderous dictatorship in Guatemala back in the 1980s. That was an evangelical-led dictatorship. I find these people scary, and I think we agree. What we're trying to do is undermine these people. Yeah. And if people want to be a liberal Christian, fine. I don't agree, and we can debate it in a friendly way. But these people, I don't like them.
Yeah, my brother's lived in the U.S. for about 30 years or so. Actually, probably closer to 34 now. And he's very much Republican leaning in his ideas. He's not an evangelical. If I had to describe him, he probably be a deist, if not an agnostic. And I told him within the last 10 years, he's always sending these scaremongering, Islamophobia emails like, oh, the Muslims are coming for us. And I'm like, dude, the Christians in the U.S. scare me a hell of a lot more than the Muslims do.
Very much so. Very much so. They're trying to get a foothold in Britain. They've got their think tanks. They've got their people who are trying to influence the Conservative Party, but they're not getting very far. Our current Prime Minister is a Hindu, and I don't think, people don't think much of him, but the fact that he's a Hindu doesn't really bother anybody. The person who will probably be the Prime Minister after the next election is an atheist, and it doesn't bother anybody. Tony Blair was a very strong Christian, and he kept it quiet.
Yeah. Wasn't Church of England membership is at an all-time low. There's even talk of divesting the Church of England from the monarchy because it's just such an anachronism. It just doesn't belong to modern England. But
the government has just decided to increase the number of church schools. And the government has previously, a church school was allowed to have 50% of pupils come from their denomination, but for the rest they can't discriminate. The government's about to abolish that and allow church schools to discriminate and only have people from their denomination. You get a lot of people in England who will attend church in order to get their kid into a good school. And then once the kid is in school, they stop going to church.
Yeah, I know people in my native Canada, where they have separate public schools and Catholic schools, and there are parents who will send their kids to the Catholic school. So, and a friend of mine actually he'd had a Protestant wedding. He was raised Catholic, but he doesn't believe. Married a Protestant, had a Protestant wedding, but to get their kid into Catholic school, they had to have a Catholic wedding and a Catholic baptism because the Protestant one wasn't good enough.
Okay, didn't count. Yeah. Do you know about Boris Johnson's third marriage?
I probably heard
when he got married. He was the Prime Minister of Britain. When he got married to his current wife, they got married in a Catholic church, despite the fact that he'd been married and divorced twice. And the way they got around this was they said the other weddings happened in Protestant churches, so they don't count.
Yeah.
And I thought, my God, the Catholic Church are such hypocrites.
Yeah, during World War II, Hitler was never excommunicated. You know who the Catholic Church excommunicated? Joseph Goebbels, because he was a Catholic who married a Protestant. So for that, they excommunicated him, but not for Hitler for massacring, 6 million people.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
The church has got some splaining to do.
It does. It certainly does. It certainly does. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, well, it's been about an hour, so probably time to wrap it up. So I do thank you, Paul, for coming on and sharing your thoughts. We'll put a link in the description if you want to find Paul's book, The Omega Course. Please check it out. It's full of useful information, as you said, like presented
And
in
a
this
story.
style.
It's got a story as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's got lots of historical deconstructions in there. So if you are struggling with your faith and you want to see some of this contextual uh, understandings, by all means, please read it. And if it shoves you over the fence to our team, then all the better.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Jason. It's been fun. I've enjoyed talking to you.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you for coming on. Again, people, please check out the description. There'll be some links to some of the books we've mentioned, Paul's book, the other scholars we've discussed will be there. We please invite everyone to like and subscribe, and we'll see everybody on the next podcast. Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, thanks for listening, and don't forget we're on YouTube, so follow us on YouTube. Just search for Atheist Alliance International, and please subscribe and hit that notification bell. We're also on all of your favourite podcast platforms, so make sure that you follow us on there as well. See you next time.